and welcome to another episode of PDA Dads UK. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at the topic of ableism. Now, you may not have heard the term ableism, you may have are confused about it, you may actually know what it is. But I find it's an issue that is out there that a lot of people don't really understand, and therefore it sort of goes unnoticed in a way. So I want to look at what ableism is, how we can tackle it, and what we can do to make it more understood and less of an issue. So what is ableism? Ableism is an ism. So when you think of sexism, when you think of racism, any of those isms, that is what ableism is. It's an ism, it's against able. So I think it should almost be rephrased as disableism, because really what it comes down to is if somebody has a disability or a condition, then it is the prejudice that is against them in society. Now, we as a society are very good at tackling social injustice. We're not perfect, and there's a long way to go, but from where we were even 10, 15 years ago, we've come a long way. There's a real sense of we shouldn't have social injustices in our country, in the Western civilization in general. And so, you know, when these things come about, we have a really strong way of tackling it, and it gets out there and get dealt with and are built on, and we build a better society, in my opinion, for doing that. When we are accepting of all people, when we are accepting of anybody regardless of who or what they are, then we live in a better society. We live in a more understanding society, and a society that people feel comfortable to be a part of. Now, ableism is basically, as I say, the prejudice against any kind of different ability or disability. So we tackled not so long ago the issue of the Colgate ad, and we reached out to Colgate and talked to them and came out with a really positive result. But their initial ad basically indirectly stated that people with any kind of learning disability or difficulties are troubled. Now, that is ableism, because it puts people in a lower position, if that makes sense. Basically, when you look at ableism, it is prejudice against disability. So to put trouble sets that prejudice. Now, Colgate were fantastic, and they did deal with that. And they changed it based on that information coming back. And we had that fantastic interview with the Grumpy Dads, which you can look at. The link will be in the description, where we talked to their head of research and development and really went through a lot of this stuff. And it was fantastic to get that kind of response. However, for the majority of the time, ableism isn't something that's really tackled. The reason is, I believe, this is a personal reflection, but I believe the problem is that disability, if you're going to tackle ableism in any sort of way, it's not necessarily a cheap option. We can tackle things like racism and sexism by changing the way we talk, by the way we perceive, and the way that we act in certain circumstances and around certain people. What we can't do is just make the world disability friendly without an expense. So my friend Simon Sampson, who runs Ability Access, he's one of the panelists that we have on the Grumpy Gits, and he had a recent experience where he'd gone to an arcade. He'd gone in, he has a motor scooter, he's paralysed from the waist down. He'd gone in on a motor scooter, and they wouldn't allow him to go in on the motor scooter because they have a ban on them. Now, that there may be good reasons for that ban. However, because he's paralysed from the waist down, he can't get around anyway. So it's basically shutting him out. There were no adaptations or acknowledgements that this needed to be addressed and amended. So that's a really classic example of ableism in action. Another really good example, and this is a current one that is out there at the moment and isn't being addressed as it should be, is a company called Blobs. Now, they've developed an app that's supposed to help with non-verbal or pre-verbal kids, to help them with their speech. However, their ad is really, really offensive. And they've been notified of this, and they haven't had any kind of a response back. So they haven't tried to address this in any way, shape, or form. The complete opposite of what happened with Colgate. Now, this ad, you'll see it here, basically shows the non-verbal, pre-verbal child and the child after having this amazing app and what it's done for them. And if you look, the depiction of the non-verbal pre-verbal child is just so offensive in so many ways. He's got drool coming out of his mouth, the speech bubble and the black mess. It is just a really offensive way of portraying that particular condition. And it's, you know, the idea is the ad's still saying, and here's the example. So going to verbal and suddenly it's a happy child. So the child in the first picture is really unhappy. When they get to the now verbal child, suddenly all the problems are solved and there's the characters around and everything's so much happier. And it's just such an offensive piece of advertising material. Now the ad's been taken away. They have acted on that. It's not on their website now. But there's been no acknowledgement to the community that this was wrong. There's been no response. It's basically, let's just shut up and hope this goes away, which it isn't. If you go onto Twitter, it's aflame with people who are really, really upset about this. So I don't know what prompted them to put this ad out. I don't know who was doing their market research and thinking this would be a good idea. If you're going to try and reach out to a particular group of people, which you are specifically doing with this, to then get that ad so wrong is just ridiculous. I don't want to harp on that. They need to respond. They need to come back and answer to it and acknowledge that what they did was wrong. But the point is, the ad itself is ableist. It is depicting somebody who has a condition or a disability or a learning challenge or whatever it may be, learning disability. They're basically lumping them all in as less than everybody else. That ad in itself is portraying the pre-verbal child as less than the verbal child. Now that is ableism in a nutshell. When we are prejudiced, when we are considering any sector of society as less than, that is when you hit isms. The only way to tackle isms is to say, I'm not going to be part of this, and we change our way of thinking. Now, for me, I'm 100% certain that prior to becoming part of the SEN community, you know, being thrust into it with my daughter's condition and my wife's difficulties, it's something I'm almost certain I was guilty of because I was just unaware, uneducated and ignorant, basically, and I'm prepared to wear that. The difference is now I've had my eyes open and I can see it, and I see it everywhere, and it can come in so many ways. Schools are a great example. Ableism is rife within schools because if a child is too challenging, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to tell the story of my daughter in her schooling and how we went to get her into SEN education in the end. And it's because the school that she was at just couldn't cope. Now, her first school were fantastic. We changed schools because we moved to a different locality. Her first school were great, and they did everything they could to try and adapt and make life work at school for my daughter. They had a sensory area they built outside the classroom so she could go out into it. They'd sort of set up almost like a circuit around the school. So if she ran off, they had it safe. They knew that she would come back round and they could intervene. When we switched to the new school that she went to, it was the complete opposite. They spoke very highly of their efforts with SEN and their ability to cope, and it would be a fantastic environment. It was a small school. We thought it would be fantastic. It might be better because there was less of that sort of pressure around. It didn't work that way. In fact, it was the polar opposite. And basically, because they couldn't address her needs within the school, rather than try to adapt properly, they just exclude her. So she was getting excluded for 3 days out of 5 every week because they couldn't cope with the behaviours. If she lashed out, if she was reactionary, it was just gone, 3 days, bye, see you later. So we'd have Monday, Tuesday, and she learnt that if she acted out, she got a few days off school. She was more than happy with that. So she'd actually do it to, you know, get that reward as she saw it. I get to be at home, that's great. It was pure, that is ableism, because they considered her less important than everybody else in the class. So rather than trying to adapt so that she was able to have an education and be learning and be in school. And for me, school is not just about education. In fact, more so, it's about social education and learning to be with others and work with others. So the difference on going into a special educational needs school that she's at now is that they have an understanding. They take the time to get to know her. They have the adaptation's already in place to make that work. Now, I'm not suggesting that all schools should be able to just adapt for any SEND child. That's just not the case, and that's unrealistic. You know, there are SEND schools for a reason, but they're so hard to get into. You talk to any person who's in the process of trying to get their child into special needs education at the moment, and it's just, there aren't spaces, there's not enough of it around. So the education system in general is letting down our kids because there's no accommodation for kids who are in an area where there may be no spaces left in a special educational needs school, and that is ableism. They are considered less important than everybody else because they have these needs and they're harder to adapt to, because it costs money to adapt to, because it takes not just a shift in our mentality, but a shift in how we go about doing things, and that's just huge. Isms will likely always be with us, and we'll get them one way or another no matter what we do. There will always be people who are racist, there will always be people who are sexist. Thankfully, they're in a minimum, and you know, we don't have to put up with that, and we can just leave them be and move on, say our piece and get out of there. We don't have to agree with it. When it comes to ableism, it actually takes a societal shift. We need to shift from seeing our people with a different ability as less than, and we need to start seeing all people as equal to, and that's the real key. For my daughter, her disabilities aren't visible. Her conditions aren't obvious until you know her a little bit. And that's with all kids that are autistic, or most kids that are autistic, or have some kind of learning disability or, you know, challenges in that way. It's not obvious necessarily. It's why the sunflower lanyards before COVID were fantastic, because you could actually see a representation that was fairly subtle that said, there's a difference here. And to be accepting of it, and staff in shops were trained to recognise that. Now it's become an excuse not to wear a mask, but we won't go into that. The point is that ableism is something that we need to tackle as a society, because if we want to be a society that is truly holding all people up as equal, that's all people, every single person, regardless of ability. We need to be making adaptations that make things equal, you know, make things easier to access, education, shops, anything that, you know, any part of life that we take for granted. You know, I can just walk into Sainsbury's, it's not an issue. For somebody who's in a wheelchair, reaching up to the top shelf becomes a real challenge. How do you overcome that? You know, there's just so many, you know, different things. And for my daughter, she gets into a crowded situation where there's lots of lights or lots of sounds or lots of people, and she's going to have a reaction. How do we adapt that? I'm not saying that every situation needs to be changed, but we need to be, it's the shift of that perception. If we stop seeing disability as less than and see it as equal to, we will overcome ableism, and it will be up there with all the other things that we've put out there that we are trying to amend in our society to make our society a better place. And it starts with us, it starts with our attitudes. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. I wanted to get it out there, and it's something that I want people to start thinking about and really getting to grips with. Ableism is something that we can change, and it's something we need to change. Thank you for watching. Please do hit like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when there's new content coming up on the channel. Got loads of stuff coming up. Do stay safe. I want to hear from you in the comments. If you've experienced ableism, I'd love to hear about it. If you have a disability or a condition and you've experienced this in your day-to-day life, please put it in the comments. If you are somebody who's like myself, come to a point and you're suddenly realizing this is there, what are you doing to change it? Chuck it in the comments. I really want to hear about it. Stay safe, and I'll see you again on the next episode.